In this video, we're going to continue to take a look at the coordinate plane and how to graph values on the coordinate plane. But our focus today is going to be on graphing rational numbers on the coordinate plane by using quadrants, ordered pairs, and the origin. So I kept the language of the discipline, depth, and complexity icon because we're really focusing on understanding what a quadrant is, what ordered pairs are, and then what the origin is. So we'll be referring back to those definitions as we move throughout the lesson. We're going to take a look at your solve and share on page 191. And we're going to look at the skill for your solve and share and then also for your look back. So your solve and share says the x coordinate of a point B is -1 3/4. The y coordinate is 2.5. Graph and label point B on the coordinate plane. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write out my ordered pair. So B as an ordered pair is going to be -1 3/4 and then 2.5. So let me write that a little smaller. So B is going to be -1 3/4 and then my y coordinate is 2.5. So just by getting it in that ordered pair, it's going to make sure that it's a little bit easier for me to see, and then it's also making sure that I'm graphing correctly when I do that. So I identify the quadrant that it's going to be in. If I have a negative x and a positive y, I'm going to be in quadrant 2. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to graph my point where it needs to go. First thing I need to do is I need to see what the value is of each one of my little tick marks. So I start at the 0 and I count to -1. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. That tells me that each one of these little tick marks is going to be equal to 1/4. So that makes it easy for when I'm graphing 1 3/4. So I'm going to go to -1, -1 1/4, -1 1/2, -1 3/4, and then I'm going to go up to 2. So notice I'm traveling that line with my mouse. So I would normally do it with my finger. So I'm at 2, and then I'm going to go to 2 1/4, and then 2 1/2, and I'm going to mark my point, and I'm going to label it as point B. Okay, so that is my solve and share. So I've graphed it. Now the convince me says point R is a reflection or mirror image of point B across the x-axis. Graph and label point R. So we talked about this in 4-1 where we're reflecting across an axis, our values are going to change. So if I'm reflecting across the y-axis, I need to see which values are going to change. Well, I moved from quadrant 2 to quadrant 3. And what I know about quadrant 3 is that all of the values are going to be negative. So -1 3/4 stays the same, but 2.5, I'm now going to use the opposite of 2.5, and I get -2.5. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reflect that. So what's nice is I already have 1 3/4 marked on my line. So I'm going to go ahead and just follow that line down until I get to 2.5. So here's 2, 2 1/4, 2.5. So I'm going to mark it, and then I'm going to mark it with an R. So that would be how I would determine and find a reflection across the x-axis. So again, noticing that 2.5 is opposite of -2.5 because I switched from quadrant 2 to quadrant 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at our next page. So we're going to be looking at describing points that have rational numbers as coordinates. That's our focus for today. And so if we take a look at our map, we're going to describe this by either using fractions or by using decimals. So it's really going to be a personal preference unless asked to give the coordinates one way or another. Okay. So it says a grid map of Washington, D.C. is shown at the right. What are the coordinates of the location of the Jefferson Memorial? So I first need to identify the Jefferson Memorial and what quadrant it is. So Jefferson Memorial is going to be in quadrant 4. And again, what we know about quadrant 4 is that quadrant 4 is going to be positive x, negative y. So I should have a positive x coordinate and a negative y coordinate. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just go over to the line of the Jefferson Memorial. So I always move left to right first, and then I move up to down. So it looks like I am going to go 1, 2, and then I'm on the line with the Jefferson Memorial. So I'm 2 ticks in, but I first need to figure out what that 2 ticks means. So I'm going to just go from 0 to 1. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So because it took 4 lines to get to 1, I know that again, I'm still working with each one of those tick marks being 1/4. So now I'm going to go ahead. So I know that Jefferson's Memorial is 2 tick marks in. So because it's 2 tick marks in, it's going to be 1/2. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move down. So I moved, follow it down. And then when I draw my line over to see this is where I'm at, well, I am 1 tick mark away from 2. So that tells me I'm going to be at -1 3/4. So there's my coordinate. So I wrote my coordinates as a fraction first, but if I wanted to write them as a decimal, I would just simply convert them into decimal. So 1/2 would be represented as 0 and 5/10, and then -1/3 would be 1.75. So again, unless they say write it as a fraction or write it as a decimal, I'm going to leave the choice up to you on how you want to write your rational number. Okay. So if we take a look at your convince me, the convince me says write the coordinates of the location of the FBI building using decimals and using fractions. So we need to identify the FBI building. So when we take a look at the FBI building, it's over here. So this is going to be quadrant 1. And what we know about quadrant 1 is that quadrant 1, all of my coordinates are going to be positive. It's a positive, positive. So both values are going to be positive numbers. So again, I'm going to start by looking at my x value. So I start at my origin. We always start at 0, 0 and work our way over. So I move all the way over. My first coordinate is going to be 2. So I'm going to write a 2. My next, my next coordinate, I'm going to go up 1. And when I go up 1 tick mark, that's going to be 1/4. Now, if I wanted to write these values using a decimal, it would be 2 and then 0.25. So those are my values for the coordinate. And I always need to make sure that my coordinate or that my ordered pair is written with parentheses and a comma. If you don't write it like this, it's not an ordered pair and I won't count it as correct. Okay. So we're going to move into your next page. So we're going to move into your guided practice. So when we take a look at your guided practice, maybe, let me get this going. When we take a look at your guided practice, so on number 1, it says, on a larger map, the coordinates for the location of another DC landmark are 8, -10. In which quadrant of the map is this landmark located? Explain how you can tell from the coordinates. So just by looking at the coordinates, we have a positive and we have a negative. And if we go back to our learning target said that I can graph rational numbers in a coordinate plane by using an ordered pair, quadrants, and the origin. So I'm looking at this and I have my ordered pair and I'm going to look at the quadrant that it's going to be. I have a positive in my x and a negative in my y. So if I have a positive and a negative, that tells me that I'm going to be in quadrant 4. And so when I write quadrant 4 as my answer, I'm going to write quadrant. And my quadrant is always written with Roman numerals. And it's quadrant 4 because x is positive and y is negative. And when I have that happen with ordered pairs, that tells me that I'm going to be within quadrant 4. Okay? If we take a look at question number 2, question number 2 says, what are the coordinates of the point that is a reflection of the point at the Jefferson Memorial across the y-axis? So if we take a look and we go back to that next page, so we're looking for the point that is reflected across the y-axis. So when we reflect it across the y-axis, we're going across the y-axis, and I'm looking for a point that is going to be reflected across. So the Jefferson Memorial, if you recall, the Jefferson Memorial, we came up with, it's going to be 0.5 and -1 and 3/4. So yep, I did both fractions and decimals there. Typically give me one or the other, don't necessarily combine them. That was just how my brain wrote these. So I'm actually just going to change it, and I'll just do it where I have them consistent. So I have negative, not negative. I have 1/2 and -1 and 75/100. So as I reflect this across, I'm looking for a fraction, or I'm looking for a ordered pair that is going to be reflected across. So when I go across, I'm moving from quadrant 1 or quadrant 4 to quadrant 3. So my x or my y value is going to stay the same. So I'm going to have -1.75. And then we talked about yesterday and then again earlier that we use the opposite value. So the opposite of 5/10 is going to be -5/10. So there's my ordered pair. Now I just need to go ahead and graph it and see that it is reflected across. So I stay on my line and I come over here to the halfway point, and there's my coordinate. Looks pretty consistent. So that is my value for question number 2. So for question number 2, you write it either way. You'll write it as a decimal or as a fraction. So my answer is going to be -5/10 and -1 and 75/100, or -1/2, -1 and 3/4. Okay. All right, so we're going to use the map on the previous page and write the ordered pair of each location. So we're going to look at the White House and the Lincoln Memorial. So if I go back to the previous page, so when I go back to the previous page, we're going to take a look at the White House. So the White House is going to be in quadrant 1. So that tells me that I'm doing positive, positive. So when we take a look at number 3, my ordered pair is going to be, well, I'm going to start over. So I have 1, 2. So 2 is going to be 1/2. And then I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3. So I go up 3. So that's going to be 3/4. So I have 1/2, 3/4. And again, you could write it as a decimal or you can write it as a fraction. Either value will be fine. When I take a look at the Lincoln Memorial is going to be in quadrant 3. And what I know about the Lincoln Memorial in quadrant 3 is it's going to be negative, negative. So I'm going to start my origin. I'm going to go over until I hit there. So that's going to be -1 and 1/4. So -1 and 1/4. And then I'm going to go down. And when I go down 1, 2, 3. So it's going to be -3/4 is my ordered pair for the Lincoln Memorial. Okay. 5 and 6 are asking to locate the landmark for each ordered pair. So the first ordered pair that I have is I have 1/2 and 0. So because I have a 0 in my y-axis, that actually tells me I'm going to be on the x-axis because I'm not going up or down with my value. So I start at my origin, and both coordinates, this is a neutral number, but both coordinates are going to be positive. So it's going to be over in this area because x is positive, 0 is neutral. So I'm going to go over 1, 2. So I went over 1/2, and then I don't go up or down anything. So the landmark that is going to be at that quadrant is going to be the ellipse. And then my last coordinate that I'm going to graph is 3/4